Cuckoo for Politics is available on most popular podcast platforms, such as Apple, Spotify, and the Cuckoo for Politics YouTube channel. Hit the like button and subscribe so you won't miss an episode. Past episodes can be found on the website cuckooforpolitics.com. I will add links to those platforms and to my social media accounts, like on Facebook and Instagram, in the show notes below. Feel free to comment on either of those platforms, as I welcome all feedback. Appreciate your support. Take care. This is Michael, host of the political podcast, Cuckoo for Politics. I am so passionate about politics, hence the name Cuckoo for Politics, and I hope you are too. Thanks for joining. This is a podcast discussion on political perspectives on various issues that matter with citizens of the world. So I do ask that you grab your favorite libations, whether it be coffee, tea, water, juice, beer, wine, or a spirit or two, and let's get ready for some lively conversation and let's learn something together. In my last episode, Shift Change Part 1, Redefining Union Power, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Sarah Nelson, who is the International President of the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA. In that particular episode, we unpacked the strengths and the limitations of union power in today's political and corporate environment. We explored how the laws that shape airline workers, particularly the National Labor Relations Act of 1935 and the Railway Labor Act of 1926, which extended to airline workers in the year 1936, basically are the framework in which airline workers govern. Now, these laws lay out a structure for negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and eventually strikes. The National Mediation Board oversees this process, acting like referees in what is often a high-stakes labor game. While airline workers do have a right to strike, have been successful in the past in using it, the process is long and complex. Why? Because the government views the airline industry as too critical to the U.S. economy. A work stoppage at a major airline can have ripple effects, making the government reluctant to allow strikes without exhausting every avenue first. Well, the reality forces unions to rethink their strategies, seeking innovative ways to engage both management and their members while navigating a drawn-out negotiation timetable that can last for months or for years. Companies, or the CEO for that matter, must answer to the shareholder. The union leadership, must answer to their members. A lot hangs in the balance. But it leaves us with this question. Why are these negotiations so tense? Is it really that hard to meet the workers' demands for better pay, improved working conditions, and stronger benefits? Why is it so complicated for a company to provide for the very workers who keep the airline running and are critical to the success of the company? Now, to explore these questions, I brought in Ken Diaz, Master Executive Council President of United Airlines, who served as the chief negotiator of the union, hence why Shift Change Part 2, at the negotiation table, Ken is my special guest. Ken has been a strong advocate for workers' rights since the starting of his airline career in 1983. He worked first at People's Express, Continental, Carnival, and now at United. His commitment extends beyond negotiating table. He has lobbied Congress for mandatory security training for flight attendants right after the September 11th attacks. He has stood on the picket lines alongside his members, pushing for meaningful improvements. Now, if you recall, Ken has been a previous guest on the podcast on episode 54, Labor in Limbo, where we discussed the challenges unions face under the current administration. He was also in episode 55, The Trump Effect, where we examine how politics have reshaped government and personal relationships. Now, if you missed those, you can find them on your favorite podcast platform or go on cuckooforpolitics.com. If you haven't already, please subscribe. Hit the like button so you won't miss future episodes. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Cuckoo for Politics. Let's get ready for a lively and insightful discussion while learning something together. What's up, good people? Michael here, host of the political podcast, Cuckoo for Politics. Thank you for joining. Thank you for listening. As you heard in my introduction earlier, I was talking about my return guest, Mr. Ken Diaz. As you recall, we were in early episodes that began in a year talking about labor issues. Ironically, I had to call him back because there's a shift change per se regarding labor relations in this time period. Ken, welcome back to another episode of Cuckoo for Politics, and thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
So, I was talking earlier in another episode with a previous guest, and we're talking about labor laws that affects airline workers specifically. As you know, the history of unions, they have advocated and advanced labor for union workers and non-union workers. And since the list is endless as far as what workers in general have appreciated and benefited from, I wanted to talk to you more specifically about the airline workers. Now, you're familiar with the Railroad Labor Act, and another issue is the National Labor Act. And I described the differences. But one of the things that we face in the airline industry is that our contract is amendable. Can you explain a little about the benefits of those two laws, but also some of the limitations or restrictions?
Well, airline workers and railroad workers that work under the RLA, I do believe we have a disadvantage because we are the only two groups that cannot strike when our contract comes up for renewal. So we have to go through a long process. We work under an archaic law that was written in 1932. And yes, we have the right to strike. But what we've seen since after 2000, what we've seen is Democrat and Republican administrations that are less reluctant to release us. I mean, I believe the last group was Spirit Airlines, and that was over a decade ago for their pilots. So it's become more difficult to get a release. And that is not what the law says. The law says we do have the availability to strike after a release, but there's been a reluctance because of how we affect the economy that for the last 25 years, we haven't seen the amount of releases that we saw in the 1980s and 1990s. And we have to push further, and we also have to get involved with our elected officials to make some changes to this RLA law that is close to 100 years old.
I think as a worker, an American worker, you're frustrated that your contract expired, but it's amendable, so it keeps going. You look at other airline workers or airport workers, for that matter, in Europe, and I'm just amazed how they could strike. The companies, the airlines fold. Not saying they get everything they want, the workers, but it speeds up the process of how both sides come to the table. And then you hear in America, you're like, wait, I wish we could do that.
Well, trade unions in Europe have much more stronger protections for workers and their ability to strike. That doesn't exist to that extent in the United States.
That is by design, I guess. So with that in mind, do you think as airline workers that we could try to see, other than advocating to your lawmaker to change the laws, which to be realistic, that is hard because most of the lawmakers are very influenced by these corporations that do not want that in their campaign. So the idea of changing it, not to say it's impossible, but it makes it very difficult. Is there other ways that we as workers can affect the change of the outcome? Because granted, a corporation could take forever, basically, since there's no law that stipulates they must work with their laborers in order to move forward, even like a merger, because sometimes we say, okay, if the airline is looking at a merger, we as employees have leverage. But is there a law that says before a merger could happen or the thought of it, an airline must sit down with their laborers to resolve all contract issues?
Well, yeah, and I'll give Alaska and Hawaiian. So, Alaska flight attendants voted down their first TA, but they were also in the middle of a merger with Hawaiian. And Alaska management is not United management. So let me put that out there right there. Labor relations at Alaska have always been good during the decades. So there was an added emphasis for the not to affect the merger with Hawaiian. So they had to finish up negotiations with Alaska first, then with Hawaiian, so they can get into the joint negotiations for that merger to proceed. Now, what I will say, we have to be smarter internally as an organization. So discussions have been going on for the last couple of months. What I have noticed is we all know that the airlines under the RLA, it's to their advantage to stretch out these negotiations. I mean, our pilots were about 5.5 years. Southwest was close to 6 years. American was over 5 years, and we were 47 months. So that can't continue. But I do believe the unions can change that to the disadvantage of the corporations. So what I've suggested and what I've had talks with the international office, I have had talks with my MEC, is going forward, we need to change so that we can cut down the amount of time that the company can drag out negotiations. So I'll give you an example. In the 80s and 90s, it was very common that contract negotiations lasted a year to 18 months. And then you reached a TA and presented to the membership. Once we got, for the last 25 years, the companies have found ways to drag out these negotiations. So what I am suggesting for a change for AFA, and I mean across all of AFA, is to say the next, when our contract becomes amendable, you send out a year before it becomes amendable. And don't forget, we have a year early opener in this TA, which we currently do not have in our current contract. So a year before that, you start sending the surveys to see what flight attendants want as improvements. Now, instead of presenting the company at the beginning of negotiations a 500-page booklet of 400 or 500 improvements that flight attendants want, you go through that survey and you use the outside experts and you narrow it down to the 25, 30 core improvements that flight attendants want, so that when you start negotiations a year early before the contract becomes amendable, you're already at the core issues, instead of taking years to bring that long list of issues to a manageable amount. And that's how we force the management team to not be able to stretch out the negotiations, because we would be smarter in keeping it to a set 25, 30 issues that are core improvements, so that flight attendants can be getting more contracts in their career, rather than the company being able to drag out these contracts. You see, we're in 2025. The contract's amendable in 2024, 21. I believe when we start negotiations in July of 2019, if this TA is ratified, I believe we can have actually a contract and a TA in place within 6 months after the amendable date, since we would be starting a year early, if we as an organization change the way we can force the company not to have that out where they can drag negotiations forever. Because when you're negotiating, say, that 25 or 30 core issue of improvements that flight attendants, from all the surveys and talking to them and talking to the leadership, they can't have the excuse that, trying to blame the union or saying, well, we got to get all these issues narrowed down. Well, they would be the core issues going into it. So they wouldn't have the excuse. They wouldn't have the winning arguments to delay. And we can call them out right from the beginning of negotiations. So I do believe that by us changing internally the process, we take away that win that they have under the RLA to make these 4, 5, 6 year negotiations go away, which shouldn't happen, because every year that a negotiation doesn't bring a TA, I mean, obviously it's just money in the corporate executives' pockets, and it's certainly not money in flight attendants' pockets.
You said something that awakened me, in the sense that in years past, in the 80s and the 90s, corporations would meet with their workers, hash it out, and a contract would be ratified depending on yay or nay or moving forward. But over time, the corporations changed their mindset and strategy to prolong the delay as far as coming up to terms with their workers. But we as an organization have been slow to make the necessary changes since we can't get the old labor laws that were established for us in the 30s change. And I like that because, in a contract session, there are a list, and when it's ready for it to be, when both sides are ready to negotiate, workers want to change everything. There's a laundry list because we learned what worked in the past couple of years and we learned what did not work. So to your point, we send the organization, the union sends a survey, and we want to change the entire contract in one sitting. But it sounds like that's not feasible, similar to when you plan to go on a vacation on a 7-day cruise, 15-day cruise, you pack your suitcase full of clothing, you want to do all these activities, but in the end, you may do 3 or 4 things because there's just not enough time to handle everything. Is that basically what you're saying? That the organization has to change how we do business as far as surveying, but prioritize what's important?
Yes, because we have to stop them from using the loophole in the RLA, where if we came in with, I get it. Flight attendants want many, many different changes, and everyone has a different opinion of what those changes are. We need to narrow that right at the beginning of negotiations because we have to stop them from using the loophole to extend it. And that's what they use as the loophole, because then they come in with hundreds of concessions, okay? And then it takes years and years and years to narrow that list till you get to the final bargaining. And any TA, the last 6-7 months of bargaining is when you come together on a TA. I believe that should start at the beginning of negotiations rather than years later. And this is how we beat them at their own game because they can't use the excuse, well, why aren't you negotiating on these 30 core issues? We could call them out right. We can be on the street right from the beginning of negotiations and possibly even have a TA ready at the amendable date. But certainly not more than 6-7 months after the amendable date, which is a huge change from what's happening. And I'm actually talking to other labor groups about this idea, and it's gaining traction. So I think we have to beat them under their own game because we're all working under the RLA.
Also, too, just to talk about change, you said there are times when you could sit down with the CEO or his or her representatives and negotiate in good faith. Do you find that depending on the personnel who they send or the CEO themselves, that could change? Because sometimes relationships are just not there, or sometimes there's cohesiveness. But as you said, I think in a private conversation, that this current CEO is different from the previous CEO. So it was kind of like, would you say it was more of a challenge or tougher to get things through?
Well, I will say one thing, okay? No matter where flight attendants started their career, Scott Kirby is not Gordon Bethune, and he certainly isn't Oscar Muniz. So, and I've always said that he's strictly a numbers guy. He may say he's a people person. He is not a people person. So everything is based on numbers, and dollars, which is different from how Gordon was at pre-merger Continental, and certainly different what Oscar tried to bring into United. I think he is a different type of CEO. And don't forget, Joe Burns, that was the director of collective bargaining and general counsel for AFA. I mean, Joe Burns has negotiated with the Scott Kirby administration going all the ways back to when he was at America West, when he was at US Air. He went to American thinking he was going to be the CEO. And when they didn't choose him as the CEO, he came here to United and became our CEO. So Joe has had decades of negotiating under a Scott Kirby administration.
Interesting that you say that because, and you've raised Gordon Bethune, Continental Airlines. He's regarded as he changed that particular airline, and he has developed a cult-like within some workers within on that side. And one of the things that you hear is that Gordon Bethune told employees, I don't know if you could clear this up, but to vote any tentative agreement that is presented to you, no, the first time around, because the airline or the company always has something better, like in the works. Can you somehow either clarify if that's true, and if you know of any other airlines that had voted down a particular contract and they got something better in tentative agreement 2, 3, 4, or 5?
Yeah, and Gordon, let me go back a little bit. I think on a prior episode I had told you when I started my flying career in 1983 at People Express, there was a merger. So I was at Continental, and don't forget during that early '80s period, Continental was down at the bottom of the heap of airlines. They were ridiculed by people. What Gordon Bethune did to turn them around and bring them from the bottom to the top is he actually cared for his workers. He actually spoke to them on a human level. He actually, met with them, went to dinner. I had the privilege of going out to dinner with him, towards the beginning of this merger. And what mesmerized about him is his actual human connection to people. So when people felt that valued by him, in turn, they even gave more effort in because they finally had a CEO that was actually caring about them and speaking to them on a common term, because it's very hard for CEOs to understand our daily life basically by the wealth that they have. I mean, they don't have the financial difficulties that all of us face on a day-to-day basis. And it's very hard for them to relate. Gordon Bethune related to them. And that's why everyone started picking up the pieces at Continental. And it was amazing, the turnaround there. So, and I do believe when he said that, for the time, going back in time, when he was a CEO, that, he was probably right at that time. It has changed from the 9/11 period going forward, because, when I hear these first proposal things, there's hundreds of first proposals that go back and forth during our current negotiations. It's not, that we haven't seen, when we pass proposals on the record back and forth, they contain hundreds of first proposals, and each proposal back, you're trying to make it better and better and better. So when we get to the end and we get to TA, that's not the first proposal. That's actually maybe the 100th proposal of a first proposal. So that's the myth about this first proposal thing, because it's not everything at the end that you're just given a proposal. You're working through all the issues. You're costing the issues, because don't forget, we have our outside actuary, and they have to open up all the books. And, people say, well, why did you sign these NDAs, which are non-disclosure agreements? Well, we have to, because United can't hide any figures from us in negotiations. And our analyst, financial analyst, his job working for us is to make sure that he goes through all the books and the numbers to keep them honest, so that when they're costing an item, we can get to a model where we do our costing, they do our costing, and at the beginning it's far apart because they put these outrageous numbers, and then we keep finding the corrections. By the end of negotiations, you may not have the exact model on the total costing, but you're so close that there is an agreement on the actual dollar figures of what everything is worth. An example of that is, so what we protected in this negotiation is our contract that we kept in place, the items that were kept, is worth $16 billion over a 5-year period. And then when you add in the $6 billion improvements, our 5-year contract is worth $22 billion. I'll use an example. American, when they started their negotiation, their contract for the 5-year period was worth about $11.2 billion. And then they got the $4.2 billion improvements. Okay, so their contract, which they came out with, has a total value of a little less than $16 billion. It's actually worth $6 billion worth less than our current TA for the same amount of flight attendants. And so, I want to bring the example of Alaska. Yes, Alaska.
Go ahead. You had a comment because as you're talking, my brain is exploding with other things that you.
Yeah, but I want to make one more point. When Alaska voted down their TA and went back into negotiations during that merger with Hawaiian, their TA2 is almost exactly the same as TA1. However, they did get 25 cents only at the top pay scale, and their TA2 was approved. So I guess you have to evaluate, did they gain for the 6 months that they lost? And it was only because it was 6 months, because a very different management team, very much more amicable, very much more wanting to get that merger with Hawaiian. So it was a faster way to get to TA2. But, somebody's going to have to analyze whether you believe waiting that 6 months, voting down 1 to get to 2, was worth the 25 cents, not percent, cents in just the top of the wage scale.
So there is no guarantee per se that an increase in, let's say, in just an hourly wage part will present itself in another TA.
So Michael, let me put my MEC hat off and put my flight attendant hat on. I informed the United MEC on April 3rd that Ken Diaz is not running for any other positions when my term expires in June of 2026. So I will be working as a flight attendant for 4 years of our agreement, should it become ratified. So that's what I have been telling people is the reason as a flight attendant, I am voting yes, because I can't gamble with $6 billion improvements. And let me make clear, there has never, ever at the history of United Airlines been $6 billion improvements in one TA, ever. For me personally, I can't gamble that whole $6 billion will be there if we find out what the issues are that people would vote no if it turns out to be a no vote. Now, putting my MEC president hat back on, I will do whatever the members decide in this election, okay? But I can't look anyone in the face and tell them that I am positive the full value that we have today will be there. So let me give you an example. So there's many different positions that people are telling me what their one reason to vote no is. So say when we do the survey and we find 6 different reasons that people voted no, okay, there is no guarantee that all those 6 issues. And people get mad at me when I say the 480 issue. They're not interpreting what I'm saying. The 480 issue, as it's currently negotiated, because don't forget, when United brought up the 480 issue for the healthcare benefits, you had to fly 480 hours. That is not what came out in the TA. Credited hours are very different from hours flown, okay? So when we were able to get all of the credits, I believe no one should worry about the 480 unless, and I'm going to be honest, unless you never plan on putting a flight attendant uniform on and fly another flight. And there are Not a great number, because the cost savings for this is very little. This is a philosophical issue, and this is straight from the top from Scott Kirby. Okay, there are some flight attendants, and it's a very small number, that have not flown a flight in years. And when I'm talking about years, I'm not talking 1, 2 years. I'm talking 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, have never flown a flight, do not have any medical conditions why they're not doing it, do not have any personal emergencies other than that they can. I mean, because you can drop to zero and never fly and still get subsidized medical. And yes, for that group of people, there will be an effect. For anyone that needs their medical benefits, there is absolutely no worry in my mind that medical benefits are protected. If you're out on a 12-month medical leave, you have no 480 requirement. If you're out 6 months on a medical leave, you only have a 240 requirement. And then your vacation goes towards that credit. Your FML calls go towards that credit. Your sick time, paid sick time, goes toward it. But let me even talk about flight attendants that don't even have sick hours and call out sick. You fall under the special circumstances. So if you can prove, because it's a medical condition and you don't have hours in your sick bank, you do get covered under the special circumstances. And that's all detailed in the official notes of these negotiations. And if it wasn't approved, that credit on the local level, it comes up to the level of the MEC president, currently myself, or whoever my successor is after June of 26, and it goes to the company counterpart, no one having veto power over the other. People think United will make the final decision. That is not true, and that's not what's in the TA. So I have no concern of anyone meeting the 480 by the way that we negotiated. Not the way it was proposed, because don't forget, they wanted monthly minimums, they wanted quarterly minimums. Like an example, at American, American flight attendant on a monthly basis cannot trade or drop a trip under 40 hours per month. So that is a monthly minimum to continue. At Delta, it's 540 flying hours a year to keep their medical benefits. And by the way, they pay 26% of their medical benefits. We protected all of our medical benefits, which this company tried to destroy, and kept the best medical plan for any flight attendant group in the industry, without a doubt.
So there's a couple of thoughts, as always, when you're talking, and and as you see me, sometimes I'm just writing notes. So there's a couple of things, and for those of who are not in a flight attendant work group, my guest was speaking about a 480 credited hours for healthcare for an employee in a flight attendant work group. It is required that, well, the proposal is that there'll be a minimum of 480 hours in order to receive employee health care provided healthcare. Is that correct? 480, right? The minimum.
So, and I want to make sure that people understand it is not 480 flying hours. It is credited hours. With your vacation, with your FML, all of that comes off of the 480.
And the sick leave. And that's
reserve guarantee that comes out of the 480. Whether you fly 78 or not, 78 comes off of your 480.
So for those, and something else that popped in, but let me stick to this healthcare issue. Currently, there is no minimum. So one will look at that for years that, hey, this has seemed like a concession. Why are we agreeing? Because the numbers could increase in a future contract cycle. And that is the concern. So what would you say to those individuals that say, hey, that's a concession? That's a hard no, because if we start there, there's a slippery slope.
So what I would say to that group is the way United proposed this at 480 flying hours, that would have been a huge concession. And I will even accept people saying this is a concession because it's not currently in the contract. What I'm saying is because we will not come out of negotiations without a 480, whether it's now or later, okay? Every airline has it. We have fought it off for years because we've fought off that there should never be a minimum to obtain subsidized medical, because you need your medical when you're sick. So because we negotiated every possible credit, there is no chance of someone losing their medical, okay? Whether it be for themselves, their spouse, their sick child, their mother that lives with them, their father that lives with them, their grandparents that live with them, that single mother that has the child ill that lives with them. There are credits for all of that. So I believe what we negotiated lowered what would have been a huge concession. Now, were we surprised that United held on to that at the very end? United broke down talks with us 3 times in May, okay? And it was over this was one of the issues, and the sit rig was another, and I'll get to that later. Because once they would rule out the ground time pay, which would have been industry leading, because no one has ground time pay. People do have sit rigs for ground time, but no one has ground time pay. Okay, so when those 2 issues came to the end, okay, this corporation, and I have never seen an airline management asked to go to Washington for those final 30 days of call. I have never seen that in my career, ever. It's the union that asks. So, corporations don't ask for something unless there's something in their head, okay? And I believe that, it was said to my face, because they're not afraid to go with the 480 issue out to the public, to say that the union is saying that no one has to work at United, and that we have to provide subsidized medical and pay 80% of their medical insurance, and they never have to fly at United Airlines. Well, quite frankly, I don't know if, whatever side of the issue you're on this issue, it is a losing PR thing, because if that gets into the public, okay, right now it took us a year to finally get the public on our side. I don't think anyone is going to be on our side if that got into the public. And Scott Kirby is willing to go to the public with that. He's willing to go to the NMB with that. So Scott is determined that he wants what every single airline in this, and people talk about the pilots, but don't forget, it's totally different, because with FAA certification for pilot's license, there is minimums that they have to fly. So, I mean, that's a whole different issue. You can't compare us with the pilots, but every other work group on this property has something of a minimum. And quite frankly, many of us have relatives or friend that works on the ground, much more stringent than what we negotiate. No one in the industry negotiated the credits for any kind of minimum that we have in this TA. And that fear, and that's why I say, if it was in place today, the 480, if it was in place today, and we didn't know it, if it was in place today, and you had that 12-month period, there is 197 flight attendants that would not qualify. However, there's a caveat to that. I don't know how many of those 197 would have had all the credits that we negotiated. So the number is small, okay? And yes, every single one on the negotiating committee knows of a flight attendant or 2 that have never flown here in years, and are getting subsidized medical. And I actually think it would be a divisive issue even within our flight attendant group.
You're saying they want they put this in the last minute because of other airlines who also have some type of minimum. But the difference is there's a credit versus a requirement that you have to hardly fly or /work. So
correct.
So,
correct. But I want to correct one statement that you made, Michael. No, they've actually had this in their proposal from the beginning, because they actually wanted monthly minimums, okay, of actual flying. Then they actually wanted quarterly minimums of what you wanted to fly. And the previous negotiating committee and us always thought that we wouldn't even entertain the idea of monthly or quarterly minutes. So we just discounted it. What I'm saying is, we never, as negotiators, thought that even though this was on the table and they went to a yearly hard flying 480 requirement in their proposal, we never believed that it was real. I actually thought it was a bargaining point for them, not realizing that at the end of the day, this came right from Scott Kirby. He was willing for the talks to completely break down. But people also have to understand, we had no more dates from the NMB. They were losing patience, so to speak, that they told us we had up into that last day in May. Yes, we did get one more day past the final, but we had no more dates scheduled. We would have had to go back to the NMD and try to get more dates moving forward if we were going to continue. And some people said, well, why did you not walk off the table, AFA, when they put this? I mean, I don't think that would have been prudent either, because we had already achieved $6 billion in improvements, and that could have just drawn negotiations because out. I mean, I'm not talking months, I'm talking about years. So we couldn't take that chance, and we had to do the best we could. And I think we did an excellent job in the credits that we negotiated for the 480 to protect every single flight attendant when they need their medical coverage. Now, I want to say one other thing as far as implementation, if the TA passes. So they would start counting in November. I'm going to tell you the year in a second. They would start counting in November through October. And the reason they picked those months is open enrollment is always in November. So they wanted the counting to stop. So they can't get all this programming in place from the talks that we're having on implementation for this November. So the counting would actually start in November of 26 to October of 27, which would have any effect for those that never fly and don't meet the 480 for their 2028 medical. I mean, they would still have their job. They just wouldn't have the 80% paid by United. They would have to pay the 100%. And it's not COBRA. They would just have to pay the 100%. We were shown flight attendants that have separate businesses that haven't flown here for Europe, but they have United medical coverage.
Question, just because a thought just came in my head. I believe the provision has allowed for special circumstances. So if there was a house fire, your home was in a tornado, there's, natural disasters that do come up over time. So it's not medical, but obviously you're distraught because your property. Would it also relate to, let's say, I know family leave, you're caring for a loved one, that's your spouse or a child. Would it relate, let's say, can you use it, special circumstances for that 480 per se? If, let's say, it was a neighbor, an aunt, your godmother that you're taking care of because they helped raise you, and now that adult is in your home and you're taking care of that individual. Again, they're not blood related. However, that's a person that was significant to you. Would that somewhat cover under special circumstances if they had to take time off from work in order to take care of that particular loved one?
I want to clarify something you said. So you said FML. Are you talking about FML caring for someone that's in your home?
Yes. I guess I got it approved.
Because that's definitely covered.
Okay.
That's definitely covered.
Okay.
I mean, you could have, I came from a small family too, where it was just three brothers. I don't have a large family, but if a brother of mine is ill and that brother is living with me in my home, absolutely, that falls under special circumstances. And I want to make people understand, flight attendants, why we put the special circumstances in there, because we were afraid of leaving anything out, and all the issues that you talked, that's on the official record. All those things about house fires, floods, lightning, that sibling that lives with you because they don't have anyone else to care and you're the caregiver. All those examples were talked about on the official record, and they all get covered under special circumstances.
Even a person who's like your neighbor, your godmother, not blood related, but they are.
I'm going to be honest. I don't want to, send people off in the wrong direction. I don't believe caring for a neighbor would get approved under a special circumstance.
And I get it because of the legalities and so forth, but there's probably a small portion of individuals who don't have a large family, but someone that helped raise them, and that loved one is now in their home. So that's
I
something
mean, yeah. I
that's
mean,
something that
Michael,
has to be arranged.
some people don't have parents that unfortunately they lost earlier in life, okay, and were raised by someone else. That's someone else that has become what would be the person that raised you and is living with you. Absolutely gets covered under special circumstances.
Okay, and that's good. Clarify, and it seems like you mentioned earlier that the 480 was
I'll
something by the CEO. Did we have something that I guess it seems like he drew a line in the sand as far as with healthcare? Did we have something that we drew a line in the sand that we would not budge as well? It seems like that's where we were
Well,
going.
we were never budgeting for a minimum for your health care. I mean, I don't want to use profanity, but can I say what I said in negotiations?
Well, yeah, like my previous guest, she used it, so might as well you go ahead too.
Okay. So I said, you heartless bastards. When does a flight attendant need their medical coverage other than when someone
Yeah.
is sick? And you are now trying to take that away at the time that they need it the most. And I believe that's what, quite frankly, embarrassed them. They went into caucus, they had all these meetings, and then they came out and made the statement that no, they are not trying to take subsidized medical coverage away from people that need medical coverage. But Scott has this philosophical thing in his mind, and the line in the sand that he put in the final month of May was he does not want to pay for subsidized medical for a flight attendant that does not plan on working a flight as a flight attendant for no other reason than they don't have to. And that was said directly. Everyone knows that that's the comment that was said in negotiations on the 480. But after we pushed back, I mean, quite frankly, they've got a lot of shouting at that point because, like, you're actually telling me that you're trying to take medical away, telling somebody they have to fly 480 hard hours when they're ill or their child has cancer or they're taking care of their mother or their father or their grandparent in their home. I mean, you talk about heartless. Their proposal that they opened with was heartless.
Which, yeah, I wanted to talk about also the tense moments in negotiations. Any highlights or to explain to the member that it's not cozy, but there's a perception that the union is in bed with the company. I don't know if it's from movies or some historical aspect at one point, videos, who knows. But can you share with the larger audience that negotiations after the good mornings or salutations are said, it gets very heated in those conversations?
So what I will tell you is there are two caucus rooms. AFA has a caucus room. United has a caucus room. And actually, there's another room where our financial advisors are and the company's finance people are. And those meetings, Joe Burns, the director of collective bargaining, and myself as the MEC president, yes, we're in those smaller group meetings with the financial people to make sure that we are also understanding what's happening between our team and their team as far as costing. Now, when we go into what we call the big room, that's where the mediator always is in. And that's where it's on the record discussions. On the other side of the table is the company's negotiating committee. Basically, it's labor, it's scheduling people, it's HR people. From in-flight, it was Dean Whitaker. John Slater would come in, but John really never added any comments during the negotiations for the entire
I know you're
47
mentioning
months.
names, but there are those who are not familiar with who's Dean and who's John.
Okay, so John Slater is the head of in-flight at United Airlines, and Dean Whitaker is who is right Below him, Dean oversees all of the flight attendant bases management team in every location. So Dean Whitaker is like the second in command at United. And then we had Michelle Sago Johnson, who's also involved in the upper level of in-flight management as far as catering, and she has involvement in training and all those areas. So those people are there. Jill Fox, who is one of the directors in the scheduling department, was the scheduling representative. And then you have at the end of the table for United, you have their finance guys, because don't forget, every single part of our contract, there's a cost associated with everything. So they're doing the numbers as proposals are going back and forth. So there's actually finance guys from in-flight, and there's actually finance guys from labor. Young gentlemen, I mean, I think they were all in their 30s, but they were always there on the other side of the table. Then on our side of the table, we had the director of collective bargaining, Joe Burns, who negotiated the American contract. He's negotiated over 30 years. Back in time, the U.S. Airways contract, the America West contract. He was involved in the final Alaska contract, which was approved. And then Dan Akins, who is our financial analyst. Dan has negotiated with every labor group at United, but not only that, he was there with the American flight attendants, he was there with the Southwest flight attendants, he was there with the Alaska flight attendants, so and other labor groups. He's currently with the Teamsters now at United because they're in bargaining. So he has over 40 years experience dealing with all these management teams with every airline in the industry. So he was also with us.
To be clear,
and then we had another attorney with us. It wasn't just Joe Burns. We had two attorneys with us at all times, and then obviously, we had the three base presidents from Cleveland, from Denver, and from Florida, who were part of the new negotiating committee, along with myself as the MEC president. And an official note taker, which we never had in previous negotiations. That is important because we have every single note of the official conversations that took place with excellent notes. And those notes have been repeated to the management team. So there is no disagreement in those notes. But that's something we've never had in prior negotiations, because as a negotiator, we would always try to talk and take notes, but it's hard talking and taking notes at the same time. But the principal two speakers at the table are Joe Burns and myself. Okay. And then we take a caucus because we have to have like a strict decorum, because we don't want something said on the record that can come back to haunt us. So we go back in caucus rooms, we talk, we get all the opinions of all of our negotiators. Even when Joe and I meet with the finance people, we come back because the whole committee has to approve something. And it gets very, very tense towards the end. We try to keep it professional in the big room with the mediator, because he tries to bring us back in line. But, there are sometimes that is so tense, the company would stand up and try to walk out of the room because they didn't like something I said or Joe said. I think one time I said, stop trying to beat your chest, okay? You've been beating flight attendants for 5-6 years. They didn't like that. They thought it was a derogatory statement, and, they got huffed. They walked out. The mediator had to, calm it down. But yeah, did they yell at us at times? Yeah, they yelled at us at times. But we went right back at them. So it gets very tense. Especially as you enter the final parts of negotiations. And quite frankly, it even gets tense in our caucus rooms because, I'm a firm believer that every single negotiator and the attorneys have to weigh in on their opinions, because at the end, we have to internally make some really important decisions, because at that time, it just becomes a costing issue those last 2 weeks. So you have to make some hard decisions. Why something is in the TA and why something is out. So we got really tense, and they can tell you, we kid about it now, but at the time it was not kidding. It was like serious. You get into disagreements, and that's natural, and that happens with every negotiating team. But the pressure is on both sides, and they had it going on in their room too. I know that for a fact, because sometimes you could overhear it in the hallway, the yelling that was going on in their room. So it does get tense, especially those last 4 or 5 weeks of negotiation.
So it's safe to
Not to say
say.
other times didn't get tense, but more so at the end. So
No, I get it. It's taking that long, and any given time, any relationship is going to get some tense. But I guess it's on equal footing that you have not just flight attendants in negotiations. You have the union leaders who are active flight attendants. You have professional negotiators there. You have the attorneys.
yeah,
You have your finance, similar to you on the United side. The company would have their decision makers, people who are head of the various departments, particularly the financial person, because they're looking at the numbers, and that numbers is very important to who you said, Scott Kirby. He's a numbers person, so he's just looking at that. And the only added advantage at the union side, it sounds like, was someone who's taken notes to make sure that everything that has been discussed is in
can you hear me,
detailed and
Michael?
finalized. So not only the current leadership, but the even leadership going after will have to refer back to the notes. I'm sorry, did you say something? Ooh, Ken,
I want to
there's
make
so
a point of. Can I make a point of something that you said, because I hear this professional negotiator issue brought up in every negotiations,
yes.
and I want to explain why flight attendants are the actual negotiating team, and yes, we have the experts and the attorneys with us. And same on the company side. There's not professional negotiators there. These are actual people, either a scheduling person or a labor person. They're not professional negotiators, because if you just had professional negotiators negotiating these contracts, there's no way a professional negotiator could understand how a flight attendant works, or the flight attendant lingo, or the flight attendant work rules. That's impossible. Okay, we would have to school them for years. They're there to give us the legal advice to make sure when the language is written and the official conversations that are on that need to get on the record. Because in our caucus, we have discussions, and I'll say, Joe, I have to say this because I have to make sure that it's on the official record. Or Joe will say to me, Ken, and Joe worked very well with me on that, because we wanted to make sure certain statements were made on the official record. And that's why I used the jump seat issue, because the statement was made on the official record. No other United work group can occupy our jump seat. So that's important to get on the official record. And that goes on a constant daily basis in negotiations. But there's no way a professional negotiator could negotiate a flight attendant contract, because our lifestyle and our work life is so hard to explain to any of the outside world, let alone a professional negotiator. So these people that say, and Alpha does it the same way, and the Teamsters do it the same way, and the IM does it the same way, a professional negotiator could not in any way negotiate an entire contract for a specific work group.
And too, that makes sense, having employees or flight attendants there, because I know when you explain to someone about what we do, or you say, "Hey, I'm a flight attendant." The first question is, "Do you pay for your hotels?" Because they're outside, they don't understand how things work. It is a lifestyle choice. It is. It's beyond a career. It's just. It's mesmerizing. That's why a lot of those who start off in the airline industry, majority of them say, "I'm just going to be here for 2 years, 5 years," and then they realize it's 30 years in, and you're like, wow, because you learn so much, not only about yourself, but your job. But it's so much more than just a paycheck. And this is why I have to have you come back, because I want to talk to you about something else, more about the airline, the flight attendant work group, because you and some other scheduling, some things that we would have to hone down to clarify. So are you open to another invitation of coming back on another episode of Cuckoo for Politics?
I am, but I do want to make one more comment that I think is really important.
Okay.
And maybe you can further it when you talk to me in the future. what I have heard going around answering questions, first of all, I've never told anyone how to vote. I just answer the questions. I've
Mhm.
said how I'm going to vote, but I never tell somebody to vote. I keep hearing this. How come so many concessions? So
Oh,
I keep asking the question. Um, I want to tell you to tell me where you see a whole bunch of concessions, because as far as the negotiating committee and the legal team, we believe there's only one that maybe can be clarified as a concession, and that's the 480. We don't see any other concessions in this contract. We see we protected all our work rules, our health care, we kept PBS out. And don't forget, PBS is hundreds of millions for the other airlines saving that United doesn't save. So we don't see what we gave up, that people are using it in the plural. So nobody's been able to answer that to me yet. What are the concessions,
mhm.
plural, that you're talking about? So maybe we can further talk about that the next time we talk.
Oh yeah, but by all means, yeah, I'm glad I have a captive audience, and I'm glad you're available to answer some of the pertinent issues that have gone on or discussed amongst the work group and unions in general. All right, well, stay tuned for my closing comment. At the end of each episode, I usually wrap up with some final thoughts and give you a preview of what's coming next on the podcast. Recently, a few listeners suggested I try sharing these reflections in a separate episode, maybe even bringing the guests back to give takeaways more room to breathe. As a creator who values your feedback and is always looking to grow, I decided to give it a shot. So moving forward, a few days after each main episode, you'll see a new segment called The Debrief. This will be a space where I break down key points, add commentary, and keep the conversation going. Because of the nature of this tentative agreement between the union and the company, I invited my guests back to dive deeper into the details of this agreement. So after the next episode, titled Shift Change Part 3, Why Say Yes, I'll follow up with a closing commentary on the entire series. This will be titled The Debrief, a one-on-one conversation with the negotiator himself, Ken Diaz. Stay tuned for that. Remember, all episodes are available on your favorite podcast platform or on kugelforpolitics.com. If you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the like button so you won't miss future episodes. This is Michael, host of the political podcast Kugel for Politics. Thank you for listening. Until the next episode, stay blessed.